Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be another classic international break video for us on the channel, which is a what we've learned video. This video, as always, when it comes to this series, is always supported by the wonderful work of 11ify, who right now, I believe is rated 3rd in the world on the FF Scout Hall of Fame, and he is on every sort of Hall of Fame metric, getting a rapid surge, so also an excellent FPL manager. But the most important thing is he does have a wonderful team strength model that we've been using for the purpose of this series and informing us with great decisions. And clearly for him, it's continued to work out very nicely for him as we've headed into this season. I also will be remiss to say that I think he's still been beating the sort of market projections on a week-to-week basis as well with his model projections. So it clearly just shows the strength of creating something that you can actually follow in terms of your own Bible for how you play the game and how useful that can actually be, even when it comes to, I guess, beating what we see as, leading, headlining, objective metrics to get us to the right decisions in FPL every week. So that is the ad done for 11ify's team model, but this is how we're going to look at the video as usual. We're going to look at the team ratings. And I will actually give my thoughts on overall where I feel like the teams are at, and then we'll look at the movement over the course of the season between attack and defense. And then we'll look at the fixture run, right? The actual projected goals, projected clean sheets, things like that, what we actually are expecting from teams and even certain players, of course, when I think about the FPL landscape itself. Now, starting quickly with the Premier League team rating models, we're still at a spot where Arsenal, City, and Liverpool are far, far away above, better than the rest of the teams in the league. And despite the drop-off of Arsenal and City in particular over the course of the season, which I think this drop-off has only graduated with, for example, the Odegaard injuries, certain games where Saka hasn't been available. In Man City's case, a lot of injuries, but more specifically, I think within defense, the drop-off in quality there, whilst Liverpool have made absolute strides in terms of defense. And I would say the rest of the league have clearly also, with Liverpool, for example, taken a step back overall in offense, which was a trend that we sort of noticed in the previous video and the previous international break. But with a little bit more game weeks of data, we kind of have, I think, the same sentiment there. For teams that are in that sort of quadrant that have just stepped into better attack, better defense, Aston Villa, Brighton, and Man United are still there. Some people might question Man United, but ultimately, I think we've mentioned also before Erik ten Hag got sacked, some of the performances from an underlying point of view were actually pretty decent. And over this fixture run, it's no surprise that they're also getting some good results. But actually, I'll also point out that, a funny sort of element of when we look at the game from an analytical point of view is you look at United's previous match versus Leicester, where they absolutely trounced them on the scoreline. But actually, that was one of the sort of least, I would say, positive results from Man United versus Leicester, where they only racked up 1.24 expected goals in that game, I believe, or something below that. And Leicester, of course, weren't able to really challenge United. So it shows, of course, United's defense have been strong, but that wasn't actually as dominant a performance as you'd usually expect. That sort of net delta of 0.8 is actually not that significant. And United, for the most part, have actually played okay. But this is, of course, contextualizing that they are now a mid-table team, or what looks like a mid-table team, whereas I'm sure many United fans and our expectations, generally speaking, for United historically are that they're much better than that. But that's where they sit, and it makes sense, of course, that 11ify's model has always been pessimistic on United because their underlyings for the last few years have been poor. What I do think has been, as I said, the interesting trend going back to last week's video or last international week's video is actually Fulham, Bournemouth, and Brighton being really good, Brentford as well. I think those 4 teams are your non-traditional teams that are very good, clearly deserving of a mid-table spot, and have shown to actually improve over the course of the season as well in different sort of ways, right? We've talked about Brentford being a very unique team in that they've somehow leveled up their offense tremendously after multiple years of being a really consistent above average defense to now dropping to what is very clearly a very sort of bottom half like defense. And the results, when you look at just the pure underlyings of the Premier League, I think will show you that sort of change in the picture and how drastic that's been for Brentford. But from a team model point of view, you see them now, I mean, close to a team like West Ham on defense, and that's not great, but the attack is still strong. But Brentford still sits, unfortunately, of course, in that sort of worst attack, worst defense quadrant of this graph. But still, the gap between a team like Brentford, for example, versus Southampton is very distinct, and still their attack is much, much better than the likes of any team that is basically below Fulham, I would say. So that's still quite significant in terms of how we contextualize teams. And as I've always said, when we look at attack and defense rating is probably quite helpful in terms of giving us a glimpse of how good FPL defenders are, generally speaking. But for attackers, it's very team dependent. So someone like Chris Wood from Nottingham Forest has been an absolute monster. And it's not simply because he's been overperforming his expectations, but it's also that the whole idea of Nottingham Forest being a worse attack is true. However, he still gets an insane and absurd amount of chances in terms of a goal share or expected goal share point of view compared to some of the other strikers within the league, which makes Chris Wood still very much so a very interesting pick. Whereas on the flip side, you look at someone like, or a team like Brighton, and you look at Welbeck and João Pedro being a part of that, they still are a part of a very high functioning offense. And of course, they're about to enter into a good fixture run. So there's two ways to really look at things at times. And it's not always purely the case where I would say the team attack translates to how we feel about independent players. And I've always felt this about someone like Bruno as well, who's been able to quite consistently rack up really good underlying stats, even over pretty poor years of overall team data for Man United. So that's just a little bit of context for you. The main movements from the previous international break that I would like to call out to is, I think Everton still looking rather poor. Newcastle, I would say, on the up in terms of recent performances, showing a little bit of a resurge, I would say, for Newcastle. We obviously had extremely high expectations for Newcastle, I think, even heading towards the start of the season. So a lot of the early performances that we saw from Newcastle actually indicated that they probably were a lot worse than we thought. But now I think with players like Joe Linton, in full form, the team actually not really dealing with too many injuries outside of, let's say, the Trippier or Botman ones, that team is now seemingly, going back to full stride. So that is quite interesting, I think, when we talk about rating Premier League teams and how our expectations can sort of yo-yo over the course of the season. As I said, teams like Bournemouth, I think, have generally improved. Brentford, I'd say overall, because their defense have actually dropped off so much, I'd say overall they've probably dropped in my estimations. But yeah, Bournemouth have definitely improved over the course of the season. Aston Villa, I think their defense have just remained very consistently good. Arsenal, definitely a bit of a drop-off, but I think arguably also personnel dependent. Everton probably showing a little bit of signs of life, but we knew that the start was really poor, and I don't think that the performances on the attacking point of view have given us any comfort into them as a team. Crystal Palace probably also dropping off with Eze being injured. Makes sense to me. Whereas teams like Brighton and Chelsea, of course, have, I think, generally been quite strong this season, and I think that we've seen some overall improvement overall from these sorts of teams. What I actually think is an interesting trend is that Liverpool haven't probably improved as much as some people think, but ultimately they were always so far away from the other teams that people might miss sight of, I guess, how good Liverpool are ultimately compared to, let's say, the likes of City and Arsenal, and then specifically that gap between any team vying for fourth place. Fulham have probably improved the most, and Spurs have also, with that sort of yo-yo effect, probably dropped off a little bit in terms of our expectations with recent results like the Crystal Palace game and the Ipswich game. But it's not just the actual performances in terms of the actual outcomes in those games, but more specifically the underlying data, right? The amount of chances they gave Ipswich, or even the lack of chances that they produced versus a team like Crystal Palace at home. That's a huge shift in terms of how team strengths will move and react to performances like that from Tottenham. So that's starting to take a bit of flight. And I think for the most part, all the other teams that are, I would say, probably maybe at the caliber of a Wolves and Ipswich, a Southampton, Leicester, I don't really think we've changed our expectations on them. Neither have West Ham United, for example. So I think not too many interesting trends there. But if we actually move into the changes in terms of overall attack, I wanted to basically refresh from where we were actually looking at last time round. I think the biggest change is Arsenal having the largest drop-off in offense is very significant. I think Spurs taking a little bit of a step back in terms of offense is also quite significant, because one of the early signs of the season, and even when you look at underlying so far this season, is that Spurs have been really, really strong. But actually it's probably their defense that have actually looked okay despite the lack of clean sheets, and their offense hasn't looked that impressive, I guess, on a game-to-game basis, even though there have been games where they've absolutely blitzed their opponents, like in the United game or like in the Villa game in terms of the goals scored. So that's actually quite significant. I'd probably call out that Crystal Palace and Everton dropping off in terms of offense is unfortunately not very good, because they were never good offenses, even going back to last season when we actually had team strength models evaluating these sorts of teams. We've always identified these teams as better better defense and worse attack. And the fact that their attack has actually gotten worse is probably an indication, of course, of generally the attacking movements within the league, but also that these teams have probably taken a step back with personnel probably influencing that the most. I'd say definitely from a Crystal Palace point of view. As far as Bournemouth and Brighton, extremely significant that they've improved so much. Same with Fulham too. What's impressed me the most, I would say, is Fulham ultimately have a very different squad, radically speaking, and Brighton too, but Bournemouth have pretty much kept a similar squad whilst losing Solanke, and have actually improved as an offense, which is quite surprising, or rather improved as an offense compared to the initial expectation, which probably was a sans Solanke expectation for Bournemouth for the season. So that sort of level of improvement, considering the wider movement within the league and the trend for attack to actually have gotten worse, makes that sort of Bournemouth rise even more impressive. And with Brighton, I'd say it's a mix of the depth being really good, the team generally playing really well, despite, let's say, João Pedro missing out on quite a few games. Evan Ferguson, for example, not really even integrated in the squad. These sorts of things are quite significant. So I think Brighton definitely have improved a lot. On top of that, I would say there's not too many other shifts that I find significant outside of Liverpool and City also taking a step back on offense. Same with Newcastle as well. So you can see, generally speaking, seems like from the top teams, only Chelsea have actually managed to sort of maintain their level of offense, whilst the league has, on average, dropped back in terms of offense. And I think part of it with Liverpool is definitely this control element with Slot. The idea that you're trading off a slightly, I guess, more chaotic offense that produces more chances historically under Klopp. And now with the control element with Liverpool, the improvement in defense, I think, for what has been the drop-off on offense has definitely paid off for Liverpool. And I think that's been reflected very much so. Whereas actually Arsenal and City have generally struggled in terms of both attack and defense for the most part, considering the sort of lofty expectations that they set from the start of, or really the end of last season, right? Where we just saw very consistent performances overall from Arsenal and Man City. And I think in a sense, they're unfortunate because they're being held to their own standard. So with defense, moving on quickly over to that in terms of seasonal changes over there. This graph once again shows that sort of general trend that defense has improved within the league. And part of this is because I think the average expected goals per game has dropped. And we can also see that in terms of goals per game too. And people might even indicate that we've also seen a bit of a drop off in terms of penalties. All these sort of incremental, I guess, outcomes have made us think that the defense overall has improved within the Premier League. And that's really just looking at the league as a whole. But when we actually look at individual teams, I think, once again, nothing much really to say in terms of Southampton, Leicester, Ipswich, and Wolves, or even West Ham. But I think the biggest shift, once again, is Brentford being so much worse on defense, which is not a good sign to see. United, generally speaking, improving a lot in defense, and Bournemouth and Fulham and Brighton as well, with improvements on offense and defense, which just shows that these are the teams that have probably made the most strides this season. Villa, Forest, Spurs, Newcastle, Chelsea, all making great defensive improvements, but Liverpool with the most impressive change, which I still find to be absolutely impressive, because when you look at teams like City and Arsenal and Liverpool, they always, to be able to sort of have such a radical improvement, I think when you're already that good, is very impressive. And so that always needs to be called out. Liverpool so far this season probably have looked like the best defense within the league. And I think some people can feel like that maybe team strength models are still slow to adjust, arguably, in this situation. But I think that there's also the element of what we've seen from Arsenal historically, and if they actually have, less injuries, what the impact of that will be over the course of what is now a very, very good run for Arsenal. Because ultimately, we're only 11 game weeks down in the season. Every single team has not technically even played the other half of the league. So there's teams like Arsenal who have really good fixture runs to come. And that's why I think team strength models are so important, because yes, whilst Arsenal might not look like the best defense in the league right now, and Liverpool might be, and it might be the case that Liverpool remain the best defense in the league this season, but to, I guess, write Arsenal off right now is something that I probably wouldn't do. Whereas with City, I think we've seen so many poor performances that we can definitely say it's okay to revert your expectation on a team like City, because their defense has actually been tragic. And ultimately, of course, they've just had so many injuries. Having to play a 19-year-old in back-to-back games in the Champions League, and also within that last Premier League game where they conceded, I think, 2.75 expected goals conceded versus Brighton. That just shows you, I think, the extent of Man City's situation. And I think there's also an element of aging within the squad. So players like Walker generally aging and I think not looking very good. That for me will probably still remain the case for the season. So I'm not saying that once City gets their injuries in order and players coming back after this international break, that they're suddenly going to become quite easily, I guess, the second best defense within the league so far this season. But I do think that things can improve for City. And it just shows you, once again, the lofty standards that they've set in previous years for them to still be so highly rated this season. And ultimately, when you look at underlying stats this season, their expected goals conceded has not been that awful, but there have been aberrations in terms of games like the Fulham game, for example, at home, the Bournemouth away game, and very clearly, of course, the most recent Brighton away game as being huge instances where City have just given way too many chances away to teams that are, not sort of top three in terms of offense, I suppose, and quality over there. So that I think is quite significant. And that's sort of our little team strength update here. Once again, I think the most important thing to call out is Liverpool and Nottingham Forest's really big improvements. And ultimately, I think the biggest question mark is going to be over a team like Man United, where we look at them now and they're clearly, a slightly above average team when it comes to the Premier League. But how much, I guess, improvement can someone like Amorim do, considering this is our little check mark here before he actually joins as a manager full time for United? So that I think is something that I will find most interesting when we look at the next potential break, or sort of time to do this video when we have, I think, probably a little bit of time in January to actually look at that with a bit of a break there. So that's sort of my plan, and I'll be staying tuned to that. Otherwise, I think with not too many sort of big changes in managers being expected outside of potentially West Ham or even Wolves, who have just come off the back of a win, there's nothing that I'm too keen at looking at. Potentially, it's also a case of I'd like to look at a team like Brentford too, because they've actually dropped off so much in terms of defense. Is that something that they can reverse or try and fix? Because it doesn't seem like, when we look at a personnel point of view, that they've been that hamstrung outside of, I would say, the fullback positions. But maybe with players like Rico Henry coming back, things can change, and we can sort of evaluate from there on later down the line this season. So quickly shifting off to our expectations now for the next 6 game weeks. So it'd be very useful to actually look at our projected sort of goals and projected clean sheets almost, and just look at the fixture difficulty rating now for the Premier League. What I would say is, once again, this data is once again supported by 1105's fantastic team strength model. The idea here, of course, is that you're contextualizing the difficulty of these games by looking at how good these teams are from an offensive and defensive point of view, and then actually evaluating fixtures instead of the sort of FDR element that we have in fantasy that's agnostic to how good or bad teams are. The whole idea is that this is on a sliding scale, really, of expected goals to expected goals conceded. So ultimately, a team like City is never going to have a truly bad run of red games on an FDR sort of chart that looks at team strength and contextualizes there. But we all understand that there are bad fixture runs, and ultimately this is sort of looking like one for Man City, I would say. At least from a defensive point of view, it's not exactly the best. Whereas on offense, I think still, for the most part, actually, these games for City are actually quite good. And the main issue when we look at a team like City is someone like Haaland is so expensive compared to his peers. If there's ever a fixture run where most of the expected goals, I would say, for other competing top teams is similar to Man City, then you always have the question of whether Haaland is utilized as a captain well, and whether he has any value within FPL, especially if you're not going to captain very often. And I think when we look at the next 6 fixtures here on predicted goals, there's clearly enough good fixtures between Arsenal, Liverpool, and Chelsea for a lot of managers to consider not having Haaland as their main captain. And I think that's why we've already seen that natural trend of people moving out of Haaland. I think this can only continue over this fixture run up until probably around Gameweek 17 plus for Man City. But that's obviously almost close to outside the chart, the range of this chart. What I would like to call out right now is this is a great Newcastle run, a great Chelsea run. So a lot of people are looking at a team like Spurs and probably actually thinking this is the best time to move off of Spurs. This is a Man City away game. But ultimately, Spurs are just right behind Chelsea and Newcastle. So one thing I'd actually like to mention from an FPL point of view is we all want to make transfers. We always want to update our teams to make sure it looks like what a provisional wildcard would be. But one thing to think about with a team like Spurs is, yes, of course, the immediate game is absolutely terrible on paper, but that one game might not be significant enough for you to push transfers in certain directions. I would probably love to do a move like Solanke to Isak right now, just looking at, for example, FDR. But at the same time, when you actually think about it, holding someone like Solanke or Son over Game Week 12 might actually serve you really well after that, because coming off of that, they simply have a really good run themselves. So I don't think Spurs are a team where you absolutely have to be bidding their assets. So people who've moved into players like Brennan Johnson, Solanke, arguably Porro, I think some people obviously have questions on the defense, and that probably comes down to whether players like Van de Ven will come back to strengthen the overall defensive quality of the team. But give an idea, of course, of where you can be a little bit more flexible and malleable within your teams if you don't have a wild card, right? This is actually not an awful fixture run for Spurs overall. It's just an awful single fixture on match day 12. So that's something I'd like to call out, despite Chelsea and Newcastle being above Spurs here in this sort of FDR. As far as Aston Villa, this is actually a generally good run of 4 games in a row. But the issue this season, I think, posed by Watkins' price is that you have players like Jackson, Isak, Solanke, who are all cheaper than Ollie Watkins. And you also have someone like Kai Havertz, who's been playing 95 minutes a game, basically, and that's better minutes than Watkins anyways, and he's about to enter into a great run of games. So that's always been the question with Aston Villa, and I think ultimately the only other attacking asset who's interesting within the team is still someone like Morgan Rogers, or arguably McGinn, but I think that's a bit of a reach. So Rogers, once again, has a good fixture run here, but at that sort of midfield price point, still players like Rutter and Semenyo, I think, compete with him really well. And you can see that in terms of how close the expected goals are here between Brighton, Bournemouth, and Aston Villa. Semenyo is someone who also plays more minutes, generally speaking, than someone like Rogers. Rutter is an interesting case where it depends on, I think, a lot of the injuries and availability over this run. But I think that he can actually still have really good minutes. And that makes him quite an intriguing pick, because ultimately Brighton still have a very clean run of games. Outside of that, the short-term trend, I would say, is that Man United have 2 really good fixtures and then 2 abysmal fixtures between 14 and 16, but then they actually still have a decent game in match day 15. So with United, the trend here is probably, I would look to them as a team that you could invest into now, but you also have to probably have a little bit of rotation in place for those 14 and 16 games. And I still think it's quite tough to actually guess the minutes completely with United. So there is possibly an idea instead to actually just wait for match day 17 to come around, or game week 17 rather, and you can actually use that as an opportunity to move into Man United assets then if you haven't moved into them already. As far as a team like Brentford, I think the true end of the run is basically after game week 13. Game week 13 is such a good fixture. After that, though, there's a really good justification to move off of a lot of the Brentford assets. You might still want to keep someone like Weiss in the team, but I think as other midfielders, like let's say Odegaard or even Bruno, have a generally cleaner run of games, even heading towards, like, let's say north of game week 20, ultimately Mbeumo, I do think, is someone who's going to be moving off of some of FPL managers' teams, as long as people have the luxury to do so. So that's something I'd like to point out with Brentford. Wissa maybe less so, because I can understand people not really wanting to waste transfers on their sort of sub 6 million strikers or their 6 million strikers, and that makes sense. That's fine. But just a point in terms of how the FDR will probably move in a few weeks' time for Brentford, because it still looks good now, and they're actually a good offense, but ultimately this is probably close to the end times here for a lot of great Brentford picks. As far as Wolves, we know that they have a really good run of games, but as you can see, it's also contextualized here in terms of the FDR, where they're just not simply a high functioning team, but you still might be able to have talismans from certain teams. And I think I only mentioned talismans in terms, not in terms of, for example, control of the game, whether you're an attacking 10, that sort of thing, but more specifically in terms of, you know, how is the team really going to score goals? Who's going to provide the assists? Someone like Cunha is actually, you know, crucial for that, right? Because you can see that despite not actually having extremely high expected goals compared to a lot of forwards, his role in the team clearly is a high functioning creator as well. So that's the value of certain players from weaker teams from an offensive point of view, but still showing, I guess, the utility of players. Because with Nottingham Forest, for example, they've got really poor fixtures, and they've actually got the same sort of fixtures that let's say Bruno is about to embark upon with Man United. In terms of 14 and 16, whereas Nottingham Forest have these fixtures between 12 and 14. But if you, let's say, still have a lot of confidence in someone like Wood and I guess his abilities, when you look at, let's say, the fixtures outside or coming out of, let's say, game week 14 for Wood, they're not too dissimilar or too different to, for example, Wolves' fixture run ultimately, because it just shows you what happens when you have slightly weaker teams, but you have key players and they can still be very useful over a mediocre fixture run, I would say. And clearly, you're probably not going to plan to play them, as I said, on 12 and 14. But just a thought about, keeping players like Chris Wood, who are still very, very high functioning, I would say. And that's pretty much it. As far as other teams, Ipswich, Leicester, there are some assets between these teams. Even Southampton, arguably, if you could actually ever get the minutes right on certain attackers, where they're still going to have value, like we've seen Liam Delap have. He's probably been overperforming massively, but maybe that's just who Liam Delap is. And I think that's very, very interesting. With Leicester, we know probably a little bit of murkiness in terms of the attacking minutes, with, I guess, a bit of uncertainty over Vardy as well. But you're still going to get some value for some of these players as long as they're priced in a decent picture. And I think Fulham is a team that I've actually missed out on here as well, where Raul's going to have his last best game, I think, over 12 and 14. So he's almost like the reverse Chris Wood here, where he's got good fixtures there. But after that, the Fulham fixtures, for the most part, I would say, are pretty poor, 14 plus, but there is one good game on Game Week 17. But he is still someone who, as long as he can keep his minutes, and I think that is the major concern over a fixture-dense period, does he keep those minutes compared to someone like Muniz, where you can also see someone like Smith Rowe actually is an absolute gem still within FPL. And with Fulham being such a strong team, when you look at them actually being comfortably mid-table here in terms of sort of our offensive expectations, the fact that players like Smith Rowe and Raul are so underpriced still shows you that they're going to have value over the course of the rest of the season as long as they have good minutes. And even if you have to yo-yo between, let's say, Raul and Muniz, potentially, there's still going to be some value there because of how cheaply they're priced. Moving on to clean sheets, I think there's not too much to say, because ultimately with clean sheets, you're not going to be looking at some of the teams from the bottom half of the table to really get any value for them, unless you have exceptional attackers really within really poor defenses. And Leif Davis is clearly one of them. Even someone like James Justin, I wouldn't really classify as that. When you look at his underlyings, I don't think he really sort of falls under that sort of bracket. Ait Nouri, I think it's fair to say that he falls under that. Plus, he also has a generally good fixture run. Spurs, unfortunately, pretty low in terms of expected goals expectations, or expected goals conceded, I guess, expectations. And that's not a good sign, right? So ultimately, I think for people who have persisted with someone like Porro, if he's a luxury transfer, I can understand the appeal of moving off of someone like him. I still think he's extremely attacking. So when I look at a team like Spurs and the XGC isn't great, I think arguably Porro can still be kept, but it's probably teams like Man United that we really want to be looking at with Amorim, where what is he going to do with his defenders? What is he going to do with his wingbacks? Does he play the 3-4-3? Things like that will probably mean we can make these decisions on Man United defenders either now, right, to sort of bet ahead with the next two fixtures being good, or of course go back on 15 or 17 fixtures like that to sort of reconsider them. With Bournemouth, I think Kirkes is probably the only defensive option that I find interesting. Aston Villa, similarly, I think Dean there, because unfortunately there's injuries to Torres and Konsa. With Brighton, with Kadioglu apparently being out for around 8 weeks, Estupiñán is interesting, but Dunk is probably going to be the safest in terms of minutes outside of Van Heck. Van Heck's probably actually the best in terms of minutes, but then Dunk is also 4.4, so he's actually quite interesting. With Newcastle, actually, the run is so good, and I think Hall's minutes still, in my mind, are secure, despite definitely some sort of, there's going to be some sort of opportunity, I would say, for players like Lloyd Kelly to play, for Botman to be reintegrated in January, but that's very far away from an FPL point of view. So I still think that you can get a lot of value and squeeze that out of Lewis Hall, for example, who also provides you so much attacking quality as well from a set piece point of view in FPL. With Chelsea, they just have a sublime fixture run, but it's really hard to choose any defender that isn't Levi Colwill, I would say. As far as, let's say, Arsenal, City, Liverpool, I think we all know who are the good picks here. Really unfortunate with the Trent injury, I think, for a lot of people who've been holding on to Trent, because he really deserves to be a differential. And I would say, ultimately, look, Trent getting 1 assist over 11 games is not a good representation of what you should expect for Trent in the future. So even that having happened isn't going to change my mind on how good Trent is as a pick, despite the fact that I've taken Trent out of my FPL team within this season. So I still think he's got a lot of value. This is a pretty poor City run of games, but there's also the element of, is it worth moving transfers between teams like City and Liverpool into teams like Arsenal, right? Because Arsenal have such a good and abundantly clear run of games here from a clean sheets perspective. I do think that if you have the opportunity on this game week specifically to move into Arsenal players, they're probably the team that I find the most significant in terms of being able to make significant improvements within your team and trying to capitalize over a great run of games from a defensive point of view. Like moving into Raya as your goalkeeper, despite him actually, I guess, being close to a drop over this international break is interesting. Gabriel investing into him is interesting. If Calafiori's fit or Timber, you have a bit of confidence, I guess, in terms of his fitness, which has clearly struggled over this fixture dense or already run of games. Those are the types of players that can give you a lot of value with the Ben White, unfortunately, 8 weeks out to the news that we got recently. So that's what I would say from an FPL point of view is still interesting. Liverpool, if you want to bet on them being an even better defense, compared to, let's say, team strengths or even markets, Konate is there. But you also have to sort of buy into this element of whether he's not injury prone or not. So those are the kind of major callouts I'd say from a defensive point of view. I still think that against people's expectations, Everton actually looked like a really poor defense still. And their fixture run is admittedly drying up too. So that's something to call out. Same with Nottingham Forest and Crystal Palace. They probably also just generally just gotten worse as a team. So that's the probably significant things that I'll call out to in terms of clean sheets. But that's that really. I think that's what we've learned in terms of understanding team strengths and the fixture run ahead, how to capitalize on it. What I will say too, from sort of a macro point of view, is that I talked about how the value of Haaland is very much tied to how many weeks over, let's say, a run of 5 to 6 games that you plan to own him for, is tied down to him being the dominant captaincy option and you not seeing alternatives that compete closely to him. Like, for example, over that run, which ultimately it didn't prove out to be something that worked out, right? When he had games like Southampton and Wolves back to back. But now that he actually has a slightly tougher run of games, and it's a bit of a yo-yo, I would say, for Man City, this is a classic run where I can see Haaland just reverting back to 15 million in terms of price, because ultimately there's a lot of reason to sort of be invested into Arsenal, Liverpool, and City assets, and we have plenty of good reasons to get into them as long as someone like, for example, Saka's fit. And I think you can also buy into the element of if certain players come back into the team, like, for example, with City and Arsenal in terms of the injury point of view, could you actually get some more value out of these players having owned them for a long time or having held them for a long time? I think absolutely that's the case. And still, there's a lot of value in owning really good players from really good teams. So that's what I would say ultimately from a macro point of view that I've noticed. I think a lot of people are very pessimistic on City and Arsenal, and I can somewhat understand that to a degree, but I still think I would be the type of manager who bets on them actually showing good performances coming out of this international break, as opposed to the opposite. Arsenal mostly fixture fueled and Man City simply, I think, personnel fueled. So those are my thoughts in terms of what we've learned. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Hope you guys have a lovely international break and look forward to other videos like, for example, the cheat sheet, my team selection, and potentially even a preview guide if I can get that out for next game week.